Hello, I'm Greg Reaman from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration's Oncology Center of Excellence, where I serve as the Associate Director for Pediatric Oncology. I'm pleased to be here today for this virtual workshop on new horizons in pediatric drug development, and look forward to sharing with you some early experience with the implementation of the RACE Act, where I think we hopefully will in fact see a new horizon in cancer drug development for children. So let me see if I can just pull up my slides here. Great. So as I mentioned, we'll just review some of the early implementation experience and just provide a little bit of background as to what led to the Race for Children Act. My typical disclaimer as a federal employee. Many years ago, when I chaired the pediatric subcommittee of the Oncology Drugs Advisory Committee, we developed a series of consensus statements, the overriding or overarching one of which was that pediatric drug development should generally be coordinated with oncology drug development for adults, really as part of an overall drug development plan. And despite the fact that drug discovery and development in adults is widely leveraged for pediatric drug development, there's little opportunity for extrapolation and very minimal testing, early testing in preclinical and pediatric specific preclinical models. There are enormous delays in initial pediatric evaluation with delays, the gap between first in human and first in child studies averaging more than 6 years and extending out to even 20 years. The application of the new drug development paradigm for oncology drugs has really been significantly delayed in children. And the impact of legislative initiatives which support pediatric drug development clearly has not been what it has been in other clinical areas. So just as a quick reminder, we have two complementary pieces of legislation in the US, the Pediatric Research Equity Act, or PREA, and the Biopharmaceuticals for Children Act, or BPCA. PREA is mandatory, requires studies only for conditions or indications under review, and orphan indications exempt the requirement for studies, which basically precludes any potential pediatric cancer indication. So despite the fact that these two pieces of legislation working together have been enormously important in extending and providing labeling changes, pediatric labeling changes to now close to 1,000 drugs. This slide is a bit outdated. And you'll see that most of these changes have resulted from studies performed under PREA and a sizable number under both BPCA and PREA. But it's worth pointing out that there's never been a PREA mandated study for an oncology drug. So the new paradigm, if you will, for cancer drug development has been made possible by the realization that cancer is a genetic disease arising from specific molecular perturbations, and many of these have been characterized through the Cancer Genome Atlas, which sequenced tens of thousands of adult human cancers, demonstrating specific driver mutations, amplifications, and overexpression, and receptors that were signaling pathways that were felt to be responsible for the underlying etiology of specific tumors. This really led then to the development of highly specific targeted agents with approvals based on trial results in small populations of biomarker enriched populations, and really giving rise to the concept of precision cancer medicine. It's been transformative in non-small cell lung cancer, for which there were no effective therapies a decade ago, melanoma similarly, and acute myeloid leukemia, and is now actually opened the drug development paradigm to a tissue or histology agnostic approach. So developing small molecule or monoclonal antibody inhibitors of specific targets, irrespective of the tissue or the organ of origin of a specific cancer. And just as an example, over the last couple of decades, non-small cell lung cancer has emerged as not driven by a couple of genetic alterations, but actually 17 to 19 distinct subtypes, all with specific driver mutations in the genes pictured on the bottom right. And there are, in fact, highly selective, highly effective inhibitors of these aberrations that are now in clinical use. The fact that several years ago, two back-to-back articles demonstrating experience in the EU and the US on genomic analysis across a number of childhood cancers, collectively nearly 3,000 pediatric tumors that were genomically sequenced, and demonstrating that those tumors in about 50% of cases actually had alterations that were amenable to approved targeted agents that could in fact be thought to provide some therapeutic benefit to children. I think this was really one of the things that drove the advocacy efforts to amend PREA as it relates to pediatric cancer drug development through the Race for Children Act, Research Acceleration for Cure and Equity, passed in August of 2017 as part of the FDA Reauthorization Act. It amends PREA. The effective date of the law was August of last year. It requires evaluation of new molecularly targeted drugs and biologics directed at a molecular target felt substantially relevant to the growth or progression of a pediatric cancer. The molecularly targeted pediatric cancer investigations that are described in the statute are expected to provide clinically meaningful study data to inform labeling using appropriate formulations regarding dosing, safety, and preliminary efficacy. And the studies that are planned are to be described in an agreed initial pediatric study plan. And the data from these studies are actually expected to be included as part of the planned application. So you can see this really drives early evaluation of promising agents in the pediatric population. And very importantly, the orphan exemption for pediatric studies has now been eliminated. So there were requirements for the FDA to work with the NCI and external scientific subject matter experts on developing a list of relevant and non-relevant targets, which is now posted on the FDA website. We've developed a mechanism for ongoing recommendations for additions and deletions, and we were required to issue a guidance on implementation, and the final guidance was published in May of this year. Just because something is on the relevant target list doesn't in and of itself necessarily require a study to be done, and there are opportunities for deferring pediatric studies when there's insufficient evidence that inhibition of the target actually leads to a change in tumor growth. when there's uncertainty regarding single agent activity until such time that a rational, scientifically rational combination is developed. Absence of an appropriate formulation for investigational purposes. Obviously, there is an opportunity for deferring study reports when necessary, because most of these studies will not be completed, even though the law says that they have to be. In reality, they won't be, given the time that it takes to do pediatric studies prior to an application's review and approval. And the intent is clearly not to delay any review of a promising drug for an adult indication. So many of these studies will actually become post-marketing requirements. So there are opportunities for waiver considerations for products that are expected to result in extraordinary developmental toxicities, and it may be that just age-dependent waivers might be acceptable here. When there are multiple same-in-class products, unless there's a compelling evidence for substantial differences in efficacy or safety. Feasibility and practicability, I think, can really be dealt with by looking at limited study requirements and innovative study designs and conducts, including things like embedded pediatric trials, expansion cohorts, and histology agnostic development. So as I mentioned, the PREA requirements only became effective in August of last year. Most sponsors, however, did recognize the need for early planning due to the fact that without an agreed IPSP, they could not submit an application for a new drug or a new biologic. And there's been a significant increase in the number of oncology products discussed at our pediatric cluster calls. So between August of last year and this August, when the law went into full effect, the oncology subcommittee of the internal FDA's Pediatric Review Committee reviewed and agreed to 19 pediatric study plans for new molecular entities, 6 of which were directed at non-relevant targets, so there was an automatic waiver. 13 of which were directed at relevant targets. And for 10 of these, pediatric studies were proposed or in progress. There were a number of deferrals, deferrals for submission of results, partial waivers for age-based partial waivers, since most of these studies are done in relapsed refractory patients, and therefore it's unlikely that newborns or infants, even under a year of age, would be potential candidates. And then there were 3 full waivers because of same-in-class agents for which a number of prior agents had been evaluated. So looking over a period of years from 2018 to the current year, 2021, after the law was passed and it became obvious that things were going to change. You can see that in the blue columns, these are new molecular entities approved by the FDA for cancer for 2018 to 2021. The red columns are approved products that are directed at targets that are relevant to pediatric cancer. And the green columns represent planned or proposed pediatric studies or studies in children in progress. And you'll see that the number of approved products is relatively constant. I should point out that 2021, this is only year to date, and we usually see a huge influx in the third quarter or the fourth quarter of the year of new applications. But I think it's important to point out that, again, around 50% or a little more of the products were products that were directed at targets relevant to pediatric cancer. But I think what's most striking here is the increase in commitment to early pediatric investigation or pediatric investigations actually already underway, going from 38%, 14, 44, and up to 83% in the current year, which I think is quite promising. So the statute also included an opportunity for early advice meetings to focus on the pediatric study plan requirements for original applications. And these were meetings with sponsors, given the uncertainty about all of this. These are scheduled and held within 30 days of request to require a briefing document and specific questions. We have an internal meeting. We try and provide written responses to the questions prior to the meeting. We actually started these 2 years before the law actually went into full effect. We've had 19 such meetings, 19 distinct molecules, new active ingredients for both solid tumor as well as hematologic malignancies. 11 of the 19 actually of the IPSPs actually included plans that for pediatric studies that would be incorporated or be included in the IPSPs. 5 of these have been subsequently reviewed by the Pediatric Review Committee, and there were 8 planned considerations for waiver for which the agency agreed. Obviously, in addition to the impact in the US, there's been a global impact by the RACE Act, as cancer drug development is a global enterprise, especially in pediatrics. The fact that the clinical studies in small patient populations require a great deal of international collaboration. RACE has clearly changed the global regulatory landscape. And although the requirements in the US and the EU are similar in intent, they obviously differ with respect to PIPs and PSPs in content and timing of submission. So any opportunity we have in trying to achieve early regulatory alignment, I think, is critical to the success of this legislation. We've had a number of pediatric cluster calls organized by the Office of Pediatric Therapeutics, where we try and discuss the proposals, plans from sponsors of PIPs and PSPs. 21 of these calls during which 26 specific products were discussed. We've issued 15 common commentaries. These are bilateral, non-binding advice issued by the FDA and the EMA. I think this process will be described in more detail by my colleague, Dominic Karras, a bit later. But we have actually taken it upon ourselves to advise sponsors to submit simultaneously PIPs and PSPs to the EMA and the FDA respectively. So I think it's safe to say that the amendments to PREA by the RACE Act are bringing equity, finally, to children with cancer globally. There's clearly a need to increase extramural scientific input for our own FDA decision-making, but we do need to respect the proprietary industry concerns. Initiating early pediatric preclinical testing is imperative, and this can be accomplished through industry and academic collaboration when necessary. We need robust, publicly shared data sets on genomic, proteomic, and preclinical testing results. And global development really does require international collaboration in designation of relevance, prioritizing specific agents and decision-making regarding study feasibility and conduct. So RACE does not solve all of the challenges to cancer drug development for children, but it clearly appears to be addressing one of the most critical, if not the most critical challenge to cancer drug development in kids. The statutory obligation for early studies to provide information on dosing, tolerability, and signal of activity. I think we're seeing quite promising trends. It's early, but I think it's promising. Definitive pediatric development through BPCA will remain voluntary, and the impact of race depends to some extent on FDA regulatory flexibility with respect to innovation in study design, the use of platform trials, synthetic controls, external controls, and adaptive designs. Most pediatric cancers are driven by critical genomic drivers, which do not play a role in adult cancer. And therefore, there remains a need for unique pediatric cancer drug discovery and development, and the market forces which drive that clearly remain unfavorable. And while single agent studies are critical, investigations of combinatorial approaches supported by preclinical testing data are clearly required to further progress. So I think clearly there is a new horizon for pediatric cancer drug development. And I look forward to answering any questions and continuing our discussion. And I'd like to thank you again for this opportunity.